why 21 million? At first glance, it feels like a strange number. Not 10 million, not 50 million, not a clean, rounded figure that feels designed for headlines or marketing slogans. 21 million sounds almost accidental, like the result of a calculation rather than a decision. And yet, the more you sit with that number, the more it starts to feel intentional, almost confrontational. Because if Satoshi Nakamoto wanted attention, if he wanted Bitcoin to feel familiar, he could have chosen something easier to accept. He could have made Bitcoin infinite, like modern money. Or he could have picked a large, comforting number that would never make people worry about scarcity. But he didn't. He chose a limit, a hard limit. And not just any limit, but one that forces you to ask questions. To understand why that matters, you have to go back to the moment Bitcoin was born. Bitcoin did not appear in a time of economic optimism. It emerged in the aftermath of one of the most severe financial crises in modern history. Banks collapsed. Governments rushed in with bailouts. Trillions of dollars were created almost overnight to stabilize a system that had quietly been rotting from the inside. For ordinary people, the message was clear, even if it was never said out loud. When the system breaks, the rules change, and the cost is passed downward. In that environment, trust in money itself began to crack. Most people don't think about how money is created. They assume it exists, that it is stable, that its value is protected by institutions that know what they are doing. But 2008 pulled back the curtain. It revealed that money was not a neutral tool. It was a lever. And those who controlled it could pull it whenever they needed to, without asking permission from the people who depended on it. Satoshi was watching all of this. We know very little about who he was, but we know what he cared about. His earliest writings show a deep skepticism towards centralized control, especially when it came to money. He didn't just want to create a digital payment system. He wanted to remove the need for trust altogether. Not trust in banks, not trust in governments, not even trust in himself. That's where the number 21 million begins to matter. A currency with no limit requires trust. You have to trust that whoever controls the supply won't abuse that power. History suggests that this trust is often misplaced. Inflation is not an accident. It is a feature of systems that prioritize flexibility over discipline. And while that flexibility can be useful in the short term, it almost always comes at a long-term cost. Satoshi seemed to understand this at a fundamental level. By choosing a fixed supply, he wasn't just setting a technical parameter. He was making a statement about power, about restraint, about the idea that some things should not be adjustable, no matter how tempting it becomes in moments of crisis. 21 million is not just a cap, it is a refusal to print more when things get uncomfortable, a refusal to dilute value for the sake of short-term relief, a refusal to believe that human decision-makers, under pressure, will always do the right thing. And what makes this even more fascinating is that Satoshi never explained the number, not explicitly. There is no manifesto where he says, here is why I chose 21 million. He left us the code. He left us the system. And then he disappeared. That silence forces us to think. Was the number purely the result of mathematics? Was it shaped by technical constraints? Or was it chosen to echo something deeper, something philosophical? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the brilliance of Bitcoin lies in the fact that it doesn't separate engineering from ideology. The math expresses the belief. Because once you introduce a limit, everything changes. Scarcity changes behavior. It changes how people save, how they spend, how they think about the future. A limited currency does not encourage endless consumption. It encourages prioritization. It forces you to ask what something is truly worth, because you know the supply will never expand to accommodate your desires. In a world built on the assumption of endless growth, 21 million feels almost subversive. And that is why this question matters so much. Not because we need to know the exact thought process behind the number, but because the number itself invites reflection. It challenges the monetary assumptions we have inherited. It asks whether money should be a tool of control or a measure of value, whether stability comes from flexibility or from rules that cannot be broken. Bitcoin begins with a limit, and before we even understand how the system works, that limit forces us to confront a deeper question. What happens when money can no longer be manipulated? That question, more than the number itself, is where the story truly begins. At some point, the mystery around 21 million stops being philosophical and starts becoming mathematical. When you open Bitcoin's code, you don't find poetry or ideology written in words. You find rules, precise, indifferent rules. And yet, those rules quietly shape everything that Bitcoin is. The total supply of 21 million Bitcoin was not typed into the code as a single line that says, maximum supply equals 21,000,000. Instead, it emerges naturally from the system Satoshi designed. It is the outcome of several parameters working together, like gears in a clock. Change one gear, and the final number changes. But the system as a whole remains coherent, deliberate, and unforgiving. Bitcoin produces a new block roughly every 10 minutes. That timing wasn't chosen at random either. It balances speed and security, allowing transactions to settle without overwhelming the network. With each block, new Bitcoin enters circulation as a reward to the miner who secured it. In the beginning, that reward was 50 Bitcoin per block. But here's the key. That reward was never meant to last. Approximately every 4 years, or more precisely every 210,000 blocks, the reward is cut in half. 50 becomes 25. 25 becomes 12.5, then 6.25, and so on. This event, known as the halving, is one of the most defining features of Bitcoin's monetary policy. It ensures that new supply enters the system at a decreasing rate, asymptotically approaching zero. If you sum all of these rewards over time, from the first block to the last, the total converges on 21 million. Not a guess, not an estimate, a mathematical certainty. What's remarkable here is not just the number itself, but the way it is enforced. No committee votes on it. No emergency meeting can change it. There is no mechanism for negotiation. The rules are embedded so deeply into the system that altering them would require a consensus so overwhelming that it would effectively create a different Bitcoin altogether. Satoshi didn't rely on promises. He relied on structure. In traditional monetary systems, scarcity is managed by policy. Central banks adjust interest rates, expand or contract the money supply, and respond to economic signals as they see fit. In Bitcoin, scarcity is managed by code. And code does not care about political pressure, public opinion, or economic emergencies. This is where Bitcoin becomes truly radical. For the first time, humanity created a form of money whose issuance schedule is known in advance, down to the smallest fraction, decades into the future. You can predict how many Bitcoin will exist next year, in 10 years, in 100 years, with absolute confidence. That level of certainty is unprecedented in the history of money, and it changes the relationship between people and the system they use. Satoshi understood something fundamental about trust. The more discretion you give to decision makers, the more trust you require from users. Bitcoin flips that equation. It removes discretion almost entirely. The system does not ask you to trust the intentions of those in charge, because there are no individuals in charge of issuance. There is only math executing itself, block after block, year after year. The halving mechanism also introduces an element of time discipline. Bitcoin does not rush to distribute all of its supply. It stretches issuance across more than a century. This slow release mirrors natural processes rather than industrial ones. It feels closer to mining gold than printing paper money, except the rules of extraction are perfectly transparent and universally accessible. And this is where 21 million begins to feel less arbitrary and more inevitable. Given a 10-minute block time, a 4-year halving cycle, and an initial reward of 50 Bitcoin, the final supply lands where it does. You could imagine different parameters leading to a different number, but the philosophy would remain the same. What matters is not the exact figure, but the existence of a fixed upper bound that no one can cross. Still, Satoshi could have chosen different numbers, shorter block times, larger initial rewards, more frequent halvings. He didn't. The values he selected create a system that is neither aggressive nor timid. It releases supply quickly enough to incentivize early participation, yet slowly enough to maintain long-term scarcity. That balance is not accidental. Bitcoin's code reflects a belief that monetary systems should be predictable, not reactive. That long-term stability is more important than short-term convenience. And that discipline, once encoded, is more reliable than any institution built on human judgment. 21 million is not a marketing choice. It is a mathematical consequence of a worldview where money follows rules, not rulers, where scarcity is not a policy decision, but a property of the system itself, where the future is not negotiated behind closed doors, but written openly in code for anyone willing to look. And once you see that, the number stops being mysterious. It becomes inevitable. Once you understand how 21 million emerges from Bitcoin's code, the next question almost asks itself: why design money this way at all? Why insist on a fixed supply in a world where flexibility is treated as a virtue, especially in economics? To answer that, you have to look at what Bitcoin was quietly rebelling against. Modern money is built on the idea that supply must be adjustable. Central banks exist, in large part, to manage this flexibility. When economies slow down, more money is created to stimulate activity. When inflation rises, policy tightens to cool things off. In theory, this system is meant to smooth out the rough edges of capitalism, to reduce volatility and prevent collapse. But in practice, something else has happened. Over time, the power to create money has become increasingly detached from the people who use it. Decisions made in closed rooms ripple outward, affecting wages, savings, housing prices, and entire generations. Inflation doesn't arrive as a sudden disaster. It creeps in quietly, year after year, eroding purchasing power so slowly that many people struggle to name it as the source of their frustration. Satoshi was not blind to this. In fact, Bitcoin's very first block contains a message that makes its intent unmistakable. Embedded in the code is a headline referencing bank bailouts, a subtle but deliberate timestamp tying Bitcoin's birth to a moment when the financial system revealed its priorities. It wasn't just a technical flourish. It was a commentary. A currency with a fixed supply is a direct challenge to the logic of central banking. When money can be created without limit, debt becomes easier to accumulate and harder to escape. Governments can spend today and push the cost into the future. Banks can take excessive risks, knowing that failure may be cushioned by newly created liquidity. In this environment, savers are punished, while borrowers and asset holders often benefit disproportionately. Bitcoin refuses to play this game. With only 21 million units ever to exist, there is no lever to pull in times of crisis. There are no emergency injections of liquidity, no stimulus packages funded by dilution. The system does not care whether markets are euphoric or terrified. The issuance schedule continues, unchanged, indifferent to human emotion. This indifference is often criticized as a flaw. Economists argue that a rigid monetary system cannot adapt to shocks. They point to deflationary spirals and reduced spending as potential dangers. These critiques are not without merit, but they miss the deeper point of what Satoshi was attempting to create. Bitcoin was never meant to be a tool for economic fine-tuning. It was meant to be a foundation, a base layer of money that does not change its rules to accommodate political needs or economic theories. A reference point that exists outside the reach of policy, where value is not managed but measured. In that sense, 21 million is less about optimization and more about separation. Separation between money and state, between value and power, between economic reality and political convenience. This is why Bitcoin is often compared to gold. Not because it shines or sits in vaults, but because its supply is constrained by forces beyond human discretion. Gold cannot be printed when governments overspend. Its scarcity imposes discipline, even if that discipline is inconvenient. Bitcoin takes that idea and pushes it to an extreme. Gold's supply is limited, but it is not perfectly predictable. New discoveries, improved extraction technology, and market incentives can all increase production. Bitcoin's supply, by contrast, is absolute. No technological breakthrough can unlock more than 21 million. There are no hidden veins waiting to be found. That finality is powerful. It means that every participant in the system plays by the same rules, regardless of size or influence. A billionaire cannot create more Bitcoin than a student with a laptop. Power does not grant monetary privilege. Ownership is earned, not issued. In a world where monetary policy often favors those closest to the source of money creation, this is a radical proposition. And perhaps this is the most uncomfortable implication of all. A fixed supply exposes the true cost of decisions. Without the ability to dilute, mistakes cannot be quietly absorbed by the system. They must be faced directly. Debt becomes real again. Trade-offs become unavoidable. 21 million forces honesty. It asks societies to confront scarcity instead of masking it, to allocate resources based on value rather than access to monetary expansion, to live within limits, even when those limits feel restrictive. Satoshi didn't design Bitcoin to replace central banks overnight. He designed it to exist alongside them, as an alternative that reveals what money looks like when it cannot be bent. A mirror held up to a system built on endless expansion. And in that reflection, the number 21 million stops being just a supply cap. It becomes a line in the sand. At a certain depth, the question of why Satoshi chose 21 million stops being technical and stops being economic, it becomes philosophical. Because embedded in that number is a belief that feels almost out of place in the modern world. The belief that limits matter. We live in a culture that treats growth as a moral good. More productivity, more efficiency, more profit, more consumption. When something slows down or reaches a boundary, it is often labeled as broken or outdated. In that context, a currency with a hard cap feels not just unusual, but almost rebellious. And yet, nearly everything that gives life meaning is defined by limits. Time is limited. Attention is limited. Energy is limited. Even the planet itself operates within boundaries that cannot be negotiated with. When those limits are ignored, the consequences eventually arrive, regardless of how advanced or confident a civilization believes itself to be. Bitcoin, in its quiet, mathematical way, reflects this reality. By fixing the supply at 21 million, Satoshi embedded the concept of finitude into the heart of the system. He didn't design money to grow endlessly alongside human desire. He designed it to stand still, forcing everything else to adjust around it. This is profoundly countercultural. Traditional economic thinking often assumes that scarcity is a problem to be solved. If there isn't enough money, create more. If growth slows, stimulate demand. Bitcoin flips that logic. It treats scarcity not as a flaw, but as a feature, a stabilizing force, a reminder that value emerges precisely because things are not infinite. In this sense, Bitcoin feels closer to natural systems than financial ones. Consider gold again, not as an investment, but as a symbol. Its value is not derived from utility alone. It comes from its resistance to abundance. Gold is valuable because it is hard to obtain, costly to extract, and impossible to synthesize at scale. That difficulty imposes respect. Bitcoin achieves something similar, but without the physical world. Its scarcity is not enforced by geology, but by consensus. By millions of independent participants agreeing to honor a rule, even when breaking it might seem advantageous. That collective restraint is rare, and it hints at a deeper philosophical idea, that systems can be strong not because they are flexible, but because they are principled. The number 21 million does not need to be mystical to be meaningful. In fact, its lack of symbolism may be part of the point. It is not tied to a calendar, a nation, or a cultural myth. It does not flatter human psychology. It simply is. That neutrality gives it power. Satoshi did not choose a number that could easily be reinterpreted to justify change later. He did not leave room for ambiguity. The limit is awkward enough, specific enough, that altering it would feel like a betrayal rather than an upgrade. And betrayal is exactly what a system built on trustless principles is designed to avoid. There is also something deeply human hidden in this rigidity. For all our ambition, we are finite beings. We make better decisions when constraints are clear. When resources feel endless, waste becomes invisible. When limits are known, choices gain weight. A money with a fixed supply forces a different relationship with the future. It discourages short-term thinking. It rewards patience. It aligns value not with speed or scale, but with endurance. In a way, 21 million introduces a moral dimension into money without ever speaking the language of morality. It doesn't tell you what to do. It simply refuses to adapt to your impulses. Some critics argue that this makes Bitcoin unforgiving, that it lacks compassion in times of crisis. And they may be right. But perhaps compassion, when embedded in monetary policy, often takes the form of deferred consequences rather than true relief. Bitcoin chooses honesty instead. It says, this is what exists. This is all there will ever be. Plan accordingly. In doing so, it invites a different kind of responsibility. One that cannot be outsourced to policymakers or postponed through inflation. responsibility that lives with the individual, the community, and the choices they make over time. This is why the question of 21 million resonates beyond finance. It touches something deeper, something almost existential. What kind of systems do we want to build? Ones that promise infinite escape from consequence, or ones that reflect the reality of a finite world? Satoshi never answered that question directly. He didn't have to. He encoded his answer into a number that will never change. And in a world where almost everything is negotiable, that unchanging limit speaks louder than words. The first time I truly understood that there would never be more than 21 million Bitcoin, it didn't feel like a technical realization. It felt personal, not in a dramatic way. There was no sudden revelation, no cinematic moment of clarity. It was quieter than that, almost uncomfortable. Because once you accept that something is absolutely scarce, you can't unsee the implications. And those implications don't stop at money. They spill into how you think about everything else. For most of my life, money felt elastic. If there wasn't enough, the system would find a way. Governments would intervene, markets would adjust, numbers on screens would change. Scarcity always seemed temporary, negotiable, or at least manageable. That belief quietly shapes behavior. It encourages delay. It makes waste feel harmless. It turns time into something you assume you can buy back later. 21 million shattered that illusion. It introduced a form of scarcity that does not care about my needs, my plans, or my mistakes. Bitcoin doesn't ask whether I was ready. It doesn't slow down or speed up to accommodate my understanding. The supply simply continues on its predetermined path, block by block, indifferent to my awareness of it. And that indifference is strangely grounding. It reminded me that value does not come from abundance. It comes from limits, from knowing that choices close doors as much as they open them, from recognizing that every decision carries an opportunity cost that cannot be erased by creating more of something later. This realization changed the way I think about saving, not as hoarding, not as fear-driven accumulation, but as respect for time and effort. When money is endlessly expandable, saving can feel pointless. Why hold something that will quietly lose value? But when the supply is fixed, saving becomes a form of alignment, a way of syncing your present actions with a future that cannot be manipulated to favor you. It also changed how I think about spending. Every unit spent from a finite supply feels heavier, more deliberate. It forces a question that inflationary systems soften or obscure. Is this worth it? Not in terms of price, but in terms of meaning, of trade-offs, of what you are choosing to give up in exchange. And beyond money, 21 million reshaped how I see time itself. Time, like Bitcoin, is irreversibly scarce. No central authority can print more of it. No policy can delay its passing. Once a moment is gone, it is gone. Yet we often treat time as if it were infinitely renewable, especially when systems around us encourage short-term thinking and constant stimulation. Bitcoin's fixed supply felt like a mirror. It reflected back a truth I had always known but rarely confronted, that my life, like this system, operates within boundaries, and that those boundaries are not a weakness, but a structure that gives meaning to everything inside them. I don't know what Satoshi felt when he finalized that number. I don't know if he agonized over it or if it emerged naturally from a set of technical decisions. I don't know whether he saw it as symbolic or simply sufficient. But I do know this. By choosing a number that would never change, he forced me to think differently about change itself, about growth, about progress, about the cost of pretending that limits don't exist. 21 million doesn't promise fairness. It doesn't guarantee prosperity. It doesn't solve human nature. What it does is remove excuses. It removes the illusion that value can be conjured without consequence, that mistakes can always be absorbed by someone else, somewhere down the line. And in a world built on deferring responsibility, that is a radical gift. Perhaps that is the quiet genius of the number. Not that it makes Bitcoin valuable, but that it makes value visible. It sharpens our awareness of what is finite and what truly matters when there is no reset button. I may never own a full Bitcoin. I may never benefit from this system in the ways others do. But the idea of 21 million has already paid me something far more lasting. It taught me to respect limits. And in doing so, it taught me to respect my own time, my own energy, and the choices that shape the life I am building within them.